The wolves came before dawn. Marin heard them through the wall of the outpost kitchen, the low, chest-deep resonance that wasn't quite a growl but wasn't quite anything she had a word for either. She had been on her feet since 3 in the morning, the way she always was, kneading the second dough batch by the blue-gray light of the prep lamp. She set down the dough without hurrying, wiped her hands on the flour cloth tucked into her apron strings, and pushed open the service door with her shoulder. There were 7 of them at the edge of the permafrost, where the scrub brush died and the alien tundra began its long silver roll toward the horizon. 7 Vorath wolves. She had worked on this station long enough to know what 7 meant, a full pack offering. Their eyes caught the kitchen's yellow light and fractured it into compound colors her own eyes weren't built to see. And she looked just to the side of each one, the way Garrison had told her to when she first arrived, because looking directly at a Vorath in the dark was interpreted as aggression, and Garrison had been very specific about what aggression meant out here on the outer shelf. The nearest wolf stepped forward and laid something at the frost line. It was a 6-limbed ungulate, one of the grazing animals the Vorath called Heskin, and it was freshly killed. She could see the steam rising off it in the cold. The wolf backed 3 paces and sat, its tail sweeping once left, once right. A formal gesture, a formal gift. Marin looked at the carcass. She looked at the wolf. She looked at the other 6 wolves, settled back on their haunches in the dark. "All right," she said, "give me a minute." She went back inside, took the cleaver from the magnetic strip above the prep station, shrugged her coat over her apron and went back out. The wolves didn't move. She crouched at the frost line and began breaking down the carcass in the cold, working her way through the joints methodically the way her grandfather had taught her in the hills outside Erzurum, talking quietly to herself or perhaps to the wolves. She had stopped being certain of the distinction months ago, saying the names of the cuts the way her grandfather had named them, in Turkish, and then in the broken trade pidgin she had assembled from 2 years of Vorath contact study. The lead wolf made a sound deep in its chest, not the warning resonance, something else. She carried the meat inside in 3 trips and began to work. This was the truth that the Xenocontact Authority had never managed to put in a report, the truth that field staff whispered to each other over comms when the observation teams weren't recording. The Vorath wolves had no use for human soldiers. They tolerated the scientists with something approaching indifference, but they kept coming back to the kitchens. Specifically, to Marin's kitchen. It had started 8 months ago, 2 weeks after she arrived at Outpost Hint on a standard catering contract for the research station crew. A single wolf had appeared at the service door with a small dead animal, a thing like a cross between a rabbit and a stone, and deposited it on the step and sat back. The duty biologist had come running with his scanner. Marin had come out with a pan. She had skinned and quartered the animal, seasoned it with the dried herbs she kept in the tin above her bunk, and cooked it in the cast iron that had traveled with her from station to station for 11 years, and when it was done, she had set a portion outside the door. The wolf had eaten it in 4 slow bites, sat for a long moment, and left. The next night there were 2 wolves. By the end of the first month there were 7, and they were bringing larger prey. The xenobiologists filed excited reports. They theorized about ritualized feeding behavior, about pack hierarchy displays, about cross-species gift economies. They set up cameras. They ran signal analyses on the resonance, sounds the wolves made when Marin came to the door. One of them, a woman named Dr. Voss, who had been studying Vorath communication for 6 years, told Marin quietly over breakfast one morning that the resonance pattern the wolves used specifically for Marin was used in Vorath culture between an elder and a student, or possibly between a person and a sacred fire. The translation matrices weren't precise enough to be certain. "They think I'm a fire," Marin said. "They think you're something that gives warmth," Voss said. "Something that changes raw things into something that sustains." She stirred her coffee. They don't have a concept that perfectly maps onto cook. The closest thing in their semantic field is something more like transformer of gifts, or possibly keeper of the living change. Marin considered this. That's too fancy, she said. I'm just trying not to waste good meat. But she had not come from a background where waste was forgivable, and perhaps that was part of it. She had grown up watching her grandmother portion out lamb's shoulder with the same focused attention other people gave to surgical procedures, and her mother had kept a kitchen where nothing that could be transformed was ever discarded. Food had always been, in her family's understanding, a form of respect for the animal, for the land, for the person who would eat. You put your hands and your mind and something you couldn't quite name into it, and what came out the other side was different from what went in. Not just cooked, changed. The wolves seemed to understand this, in whatever way wolves understood anything. On the 43rd day, the 7th wolf, the smallest, which Voss had designated W7, but which Marin had started thinking of as the scout because of how it ranged ahead of the others, did not sit at the frost line when she came to collect the morning's delivery. It padded inside past her legs and stood in the middle of the kitchen, and turned its head in a slow arc, reading the room with senses Marin couldn't inventory. It stopped when it found the cast iron pan, which was sitting on the back burner with yesterday's lamb drippings pooled brown and fragrant in the bottom. The scout lowered its head close to the pan, but did not touch it. It made a sound that Voss's analysis would later classify as the resonance used for sacred sites and for the stars. Marin leaned against the prep counter and watched. "I know," she said, "good pan." The scout straightened and looked at her directly, a Voreth challenge gesture, except Marin had learned by now that the wolves used the same face-on posture for several things, including what their body language suggested was a question. She met its compound eyes for 3 full seconds without looking away, which she had also learned was the appropriate response to the question version. The scout left, but it had been inside the kitchen, and after that things changed. The deliveries got bigger. The research station commander, a man named Colonel Ashvin, called Marin into his office on the 62nd day and told her that the Xenocontact team wanted to capitalize on what he called the anomalous behavioral pattern around the catering facility. They were going to run a structured interaction protocol, he said. Specialists were coming from the authority. They were going to study her technique. Marin asked if they were going to let her keep cooking while they studied. Ashvin looked faintly annoyed. "Of course," he said, "that's the point." "Then I don't mind," she said. The specialists arrived, 3 of them in authority gray, with equipment that could detect molecular signatures in food and resonance patterns in the air. They were polite and careful and deeply interested in everything except the thing Marin considered most important, which was the quality of the meat. She could tell by the way they handled the ingredients, efficiently, clinically, as components, that none of them had ever cooked anything with particular care. They measured her movements. They analyzed the chemical compounds her heating methods produced. They took readings every 12 seconds and talked between themselves using terminology she recognized as Voreth behavioral science vocabulary. They never once asked her why she did what she did. She didn't offer, she just cooked. On the 3rd day of the specialist visit, something happened that none of the reports would capture correctly. The scout arrived before the others. It came to the service door alone, which was unprecedented, and it was carrying something different from the usual prey. It had a smaller animal in its mouth, alive, Marin saw immediately, and young, some kind of Voreth kit that had been hurt, its hind leg at a bad angle. The scout set it down just inside the doorway and then stepped back to the frost line and made the question resonance. Marin looked at the kit. She looked at the scout. She crouched down and made a slow hand toward the kit's flank, speaking low and even, and the kit pressed into the floor but didn't bolt. She felt the injury, not broken, she thought, but badly strained, the joint swollen. She went to her kit bag. The the same canvas bag she'd carried since her 3 years working trauma support in the polar stations. And she wrapped the leg with practiced hands, talking all the while, not to the kit and not quite to the scout but to the act itself, to the care she was putting into it. When she was done, the kit stood on the wrapped leg with weight and took a testing step. The scout did not make any sound, but it stepped inside the kitchen doorway, only its front 2 feet, and touched its nose once to Marin's left hand. A gesture that Voss, watching from the monitoring room doorway, would later say was used in Voreth culture only between packmates confirming a bond. One of the authority specialists cleared his throat. That was remarkable, he said. Can you replicate it? I wasn't trying to do anything, Marin said. It was hurt. Right, but the social signal that was. The kit needed the leg wrapped, Marin said. That's it. She was aware she was being slightly difficult, but only slightly. The weeks that followed were the strangest of her life, and her life had included 2 years on a methane station above a gas giant where the most social interaction she'd had was with the maintenance robots, so the bar was meaningful. The wolves came every morning. Sometimes they came in the evening too. The pack structure that Voss's team had spent years mapping from long distance was now being enacted openly, casually, in and around the exterior of her kitchen, as though the outpost had become a node in their territory rather than an intrusion upon it. Young pack members appeared. Old ones came and were fed. A wolf Voss hadn't catalogued before arrived one afternoon, a huge one, scarred across its shoulders, that Marin's body told her was important in a way she couldn't intellectualize, and she set a plate outside and stood at the door while it ate. The scarred wolf looked up once when it was done. It made a sound that was not the question resonance and not the sacred fire resonance, something else entirely. Voss couldn't categorize it. She said she had only heard it once before, in 43 hours of Voreth audio, recorded once and never repeated, and it seemed to correlate with moments of, she paused a long time, turning the word over recognition, of something meeting something else that was its kind. Its kind, Marin said. I'm not a Voreth wolf. I know, Voss said. I'm telling you what the data suggests, not what it means. Marin thought about her grandmother portioning out the lamb. She thought about the meaning the word her grandmother had used, hello, food that was right, not just by the rules but in the spirit behind it. The idea that the intent of the hands mattered. That care was a substance you could put into something, and the person or creature who received it could taste the difference. Maybe not just taste, maybe recognize. The Voreth wolves could not eat human food. Their biology was too different. This was something the xenobiologists had verified and re-verified because the evidence of the social attachment had made everyone want to find a simpler explanation. But it was true. The wolves brought raw prey, Marin cooked it, and the wolves ate it in a form they could not have created themselves. The heat, the Maillard chemistry, the rendered fats. Voss's team believed, cautiously, in a paper full of qualifications, that the wolves might be unable to digest certain proteins in their prey unless those proteins were partially denatured, that there might be a biological dependency on an external heat source that their evolutionary history had not equipped them to create, and that the human kitchen represented something to the pack not as a curiosity but as something essential. The Voreth were not, as a species, understood to use fire. But they had found something that used it for them. And they had found it specifically because of how it was used, not just functionally, with care. On the 102nd day, the scout came to the door in the middle of the night. Marin was awake. She was often awake at this hour, not insomniac but an early riser in the way of people who have spent their lives in commercial kitchens, body clocks wired to the pre-dawn quiet. She heard the scratch at the door and opened it without turning on the exterior light, because she had learned the wolves didn't like the flooding brightness. The scout was there, but it wasn't alone. Behind it in the dark were all 7 pack members, and behind them at the edge of the scrub were shapes Marin didn't recognize. More wolves. Many more. The sound they were making together was something she had never heard, a chord almost, a layered vibration that she felt in her sternum rather than heard in her ears. She looked at the scout. The scout looked at her and made the question sound. "All right," she said, "let me put the kettle on." She did not, in fact, have a kettle large enough for what was being asked of her. She had 4 burners and 2 ovens, and the cast iron and 6 good pans and an absolutely serious work ethic. And over the next 4 hours, she cooked everything in cold storage. Every piece of prey the pack had delivered over the previous week that she'd been storing for the crew meals. She cooked it methodically, working through it cut by cut, seasoned with what she had, adding the dried herbs and the rock salt and the things she knew changed raw flesh into something that the body, any biology, could draw sustenance from more easily. She didn't rush. Rushing changed the product. She moved the way her mother had moved, steadily, without wasted motion, the way a person moves when they understand that the thing they are doing matters. The wolves ate in relays. The one she hadn't seen before came closer in the dark, to the edge of the permafrost, watching. The scout stayed closest, just inside the door, watching her work, making occasionally the sound she couldn't translate. When it was done, when the cold storage was empty and the pans were clean, and the sky had gone the particular violet gray that preceded Hint Station's sunrise, Marin sat on the step, and the scout sat beside her, and they looked at the horizon together. She was very tired, but the good kind of tired. The kind that comes from effort that was the right size for the moment. The scout put its massive head against her shoulder. She didn't move. She let it stay. From the monitoring room, Voss's camera recorded the largest spontaneous Voreth pack gathering ever observed. 31 adults, 7 juveniles, 3 that Voss's algorithms flagged as individuals never before catalogued, older, differently scarred, from ranges that the maps put at 300 kilometers away. They had come for the cooking. No, that wasn't right. Marin thought about it in the weeks that followed, through the reports writing and the authority review teams, and the press releases she was not consulted on that described her as a contact specialist, using culturally adaptive feeding protocols. They had come for what was in the cooking, the thing that wasn't chemical, the thing that couldn't be scanned or calibrated. She had a word for it in Turkish, niyet, intent, the direction of the will when you do a thing. Her grandmother had said that food made with bad niyet tasted different from food made with care, even if all the ingredients were the same, and Marin had believed this since she was 6 years old with flour on her hands and her grandmother's voice at her ear, and now she believed it even more. The Voreth wolves were carnivorous apex predators from an alien world, and their nervous systems had evolved over millions of years, in conditions her biology could barely survive. And they had walked 300 kilometers across alien tundra because something had gotten into the cooked meat that they recognized. She had not been trying to make contact. She had been trying not to waste good meat. But these were the same thing. They had always been the same thing. On the 147th day, the first official Voreth human diplomatic session was held in the outpost's main hall. There were authority representatives and xenolinguists, and a general from the Planetary Defense Command, and 2 Voreth pack leaders, who tolerated the meeting with the magnificent patience of animals, who have agreed to participate in something beneath their dignity for reasons that satisfied them. The translators struggled. The conceptual frameworks didn't align. The authority wanted to discuss territory boundaries and resource extraction protocols, and the legal definition of sapience under the Outer Worlds Charter. The Voreth pack leaders sat with the stillness of mountains and answered what they chose to answer and ignored what they chose to ignore. Marin was not officially part of the session. She was in the kitchen running lunch service for the staff, but she had left the service window cracked and she could hear. At some point, she was making bread at the time. The same flatbread she'd been making since the outpost opened because it was fast and the crew liked it, and it paired well with whatever protein was available. There was a long silence from the main hall, and then the sound of the Voreth resonance, deep and layered, filling the building with that sternal vibration. The translator's voice came through thin and uncertain. They are asking about the keeper, the one who changes the gifts. Silence. They want to know if the keeper is. The question word is ambiguous. It means something like of this place, but also of the earth, of the ground, of the soil. They want to know if she belongs to the land or to the station. A longer silence. I'm sorry, I don't have a clean translation. They want to know if she will stay. Marin pressed her knuckles into the dough and folded it and felt it come right beneath her hands. The way dough does when the gluten has developed properly, and the yeast is alive and happy, and everything is moving toward the outcome you intended. She had been asked 3 times in the past month to relocate to the main authority base on the other side of the planet where the resources were better, and the housing was more comfortable, and the political significance of her work. The phrase they kept using, her work, would be more visible. She had said no 3 times. She had said she was under contract to this station, and her contract had another 14 months. This was true, but not the whole truth. The whole truth was simpler and harder to put in a report. She was needed here. The pack knew this kitchen. The pack had learned that this door was the door that opened, that this step was the step where the gifts were received, that behind this wall was the fire that changed the raw thing into the sustaining thing, and the person who kept that fire kept it with the right niyat, and she was not going to disrupt that because someone in a gray authority uniform thought she should be on a stage somewhere being studied. She finished the bread. She pulled it off the griddle in pieces that were even and properly done, stacked them in the cloth to keep the steam in, and carried the basket to the pass-through. She did not go to the main hall, but she sent the bread. An orderly carried the basket in and set it on the side table, and the meeting paused, and the Voreth pack leaders, who could not eat human bread, whose biology could not process wheat, turned their heads toward the basket and were still for a long moment. The translator said, hesitantly, that they were making the recognition resonance, that they were making it at the bread. The general said he didn't understand what that meant. Voss, who was sitting in the back of the room with her recording equipment, said, "It means they know who made it." Marin heard this through the cracked window. She felt something complicated move through her that she didn't have a word for in any language she spoke. She went back to the prep counter. She started on the evening's protein because there was always more to do, and the doing was the point. The doing was where the thing lived that the wolves came for, and the diplomatic teams couldn't scan. That evening, when the officials had left and the station had gone quiet, she pushed open the service door and the scout was there as always, and this time it had brought something new. Not prey. A stone. A flat, dark stone, smooth as glass, which Marin's subsequent research would identify as a type found only in a specific riverbed 300 kilometers east. A stone used in Voreth culture as a marker of territory that is shared rather than contested, of a boundary that is also a bond. The scout set it at the frost line and stepped back. Marin picked up the stone. It was cold and very smooth, and fit perfectly in her palm. She held it for a moment. She thought of her grandmother's kitchen, the worn wooden counter, the smell of the bread oven in the early morning, the idea that had been handed down through the women of her family like a tool, that you put something of yourself into what you made, and that the something wasn't metaphor, it was real, it was in the food, and the people who ate what you made with care were taking that care into their own bodies, and it sustained them in ways that mere calories could not. She thought that this was not, in the end, a human idea. She put the stone in her apron pocket. She made dinner. The months that followed were documented extensively, in ways Marin didn't always agree with and in ways that sometimes made her laugh in the early morning quiet, alone with the cast iron and the prep lamp. The Vorath Human Contact Accord was drafted with unprecedented speed, unusual for the outer world's authority, and the xenobiologists and diplomatic teams and political scientists all had their theories about what had unlocked what had seemed intractable: the territory disputes, the resource access questions, the fundamental problem of two species arriving at the same world from different directions, each with their own claim, each with their own biology and culture and needs. The theories talked about symbolic exchange economies and reciprocal vulnerability displays, and the neurothology of shared fire. Nobody in the official reports mentioned the flatbread. Nobody mentioned the wrapped leg, or the 4 hours in the middle of the night when she had cooked until cold storage was empty, or the stone in her apron pocket, or the way the scout had put its massive head against her shoulder in the pre-dawn quiet of the 102nd day. These things were in Voss's data, annotated carefully, filed in supplemental archives that very few people would read. Voss had written, in one of these annotations, a note that was unusual for a scientific document. She had written that she thought the central fact of the Hent contact was not that humans and Vorath were compatible, or that their needs had turned out to be usefully different rather than competitively identical, or that cross-species communication had proved more achievable than the models predicted. The central fact, Voss had written, was simpler. Something had been recognized. Marin read this late one night after everyone else had gone to bed, sitting at the prep counter with her tablet, and she thought Voss had it right in the way that scientists sometimes have something right and still can't quite say what they mean. Something had been recognized, yes. But the harder question was what? And the answer to that was not in any scanner reading or behavioral analysis or diplomatic language matrix. The answer was in the food. You started with raw material. You put your hands to it. You put your attention to it, your full attention, the kind that excluded the small self-consciousness of being watched or evaluated or analyzed. You applied heat and time and knowledge, and the thing you had no clean word for, the niyat, the intent, the goodwill toward the creature that would eat what you made. You were not trying to make contact. You were not trying to demonstrate human adaptability or diplomatic potential or cross-species cultural respect. You were just trying not to waste good meat. And in doing that, with the full weight of your care, you had done something that no diplomatic protocol had managed to do in 3 years of formal contact attempts. You had made a thing that another kind of creature, across the vast biological and evolutionary gulf between your species, had recognized as good. Not good in the sense of safe or edible or chemically appropriate. Good in the sense that it had something in it that mattered. On the morning of the accord signing, Marin got up at 3 as usual and started on the bread for the crew's breakfast. The scout was at the service door before she turned on the prep lamp, which meant it had been waiting in the dark, which meant it knew her schedule, which she had known for months but which still caught her a little sideways in the middle of her chest when she thought about it too directly. She opened the door. The scout was there, and behind it the whole pack, and behind the pack on the horizon the sky was doing the particular violet-gray thing that preceded Hent's sunrise. The scout made the question resonance. "Let me get the cast iron," Marin said. She worked until the sky went rose and gold, cooking the prey the pack had brought, working her way through it the way she always did, methodically, without wasted motion, with the full attention that was the only thing she had ever really had to offer. The wolves fed in their relays. The scout stayed close, as it always did, inside the kitchen door, making occasionally the sound she still couldn't fully translate but had come to know as well as she knew any word in any language she'd been taught. When it was done, when the light was full and the station was waking up and she could hear the noise of the preparation for the signing ceremony beginning somewhere on the other side of the building, she sat on the step, and the scout sat beside her, and they looked at the horizon together. She felt the stone in her apron pocket, as she had every day for 4 months. She took it out and held it in both hands. The scout turned its compound eyes to the stone, then to her face. She held the stone out. The scout looked at it for a long time with the stillness that she had come to understand was not an action, but its own kind of speech. Then it touched the stone with its nose. Once, the way it had touched her hand on the day of the wrapped leg, the way packmates confirmed a bond. She put the stone back in her pocket. She went inside. She had breakfast service to run. The accord signing, by all accounts, went smoothly. The Voreth pack leaders were present in their own way, outside the main hall, visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows, sitting in the open ground with the patience of mountains. The diplomats made their speeches and their signatures, and there were press photographs and formal statements and the usual machinery of two civilizations deciding, officially, how to share something. Marin ran breakfast service, and then lunch service, and then started prep for the evening meal that would feed the signing ceremony's reception. She was in the middle of this prep when Voss came in and leaned against the counter, and watched her work for a while without saying anything, which was something Voss did sometimes, and which Marin had come to appreciate about her. "They're saying it in the speeches," Voss said finally. "The diplomatic teams, they're calling it a breakthrough in xenocultural negotiation. The hint contact model. There's going to be a protocol named after it." Marin kept chopping. "They should name it after you," Voss said. "No, they shouldn't," Marin said. "The data is pretty clear about what made the difference." "The data says what happened. It doesn't say what made it happen." Marin set down the knife and looked at Voss directly. "You can't put Niyat in a protocol." Voss was quiet for a moment. "What is Niyat?" Marin thought about how to explain it. She thought about her grandmother, about the worn wooden counter and the bread oven and the idea handed down like a tool. She thought about the scout's head against her shoulder in the pre-dawn dark. She thought about 31 wolves walking 300 kilometers across alien tundra toward a fire that was used the right way. "It's the thing you put in," she said, "when you care about the thing you're making." Voss nodded slowly. "It's not magic," Marin said. "It's just real. It's just the realest thing there is in a kitchen or anywhere else." She picked up the knife and went back to work. The scout was at the door that evening when the reception wound down and the guests were leaving and the station lights were going off one by one. Marin was finishing the clean down, the last task she always saved for herself because she disliked leaving a dirty kitchen for morning. She worked through it in the lamp-blue quiet, wiping down the surfaces and running the pans under hot water and hanging them back on their hooks, and when she was done, she pushed open the service door and stepped out into the cold. The sky above Hent Station was very clear. The stars were out in their alien configurations, not her stars, not the constellations her grandmother had shown her on summer nights in the hills above Erzurum, but stars nonetheless, the same light from impossible distances, the same indifference to the brief bright flare of any one life or any one encounter. The scout was there, the whole pack was there. And at the edge of the dark, at the places where the scrub brush ended and the alien tundra began its long silver roll, the shapes she could barely see, the ones who had come from 300 kilometers away, from beyond the edge of any map the authority had made, were there too. They were all looking at the stars. Marin sat on the step. The scout pressed against her left side. The night was very cold and very quiet except for the low, layered chord the pack made together, the sound she felt in her sternum, the sound that had no translation but that she had been hearing for long enough now that she no longer needed one. She put her hand into her apron pocket and found the stone. She ran her thumb across its glass-smooth surface. She thought about the word her grandmother had used, hello, right, made right not just by the rules but in the spirit behind them. She thought the Voreth wolves had the same idea, in whatever way wolves have ideas, which is a way that doesn't require words and perhaps doesn't suffer from their absence. She looked up at the stars. Above them, in the reaches of space that no report had yet mapped, the authorities' next contact teams were moving toward the next unknown. They had their protocols and their scanners, and their matrices for analyzing resonance patterns and their frameworks for documenting the behavioral anomalies of species that did not behave as expected. They were careful people, most of them. Serious people. People who understood the stakes. They did not have Marin's cast iron pan. They did not have 11 years of knowing, in the cellular memory of someone who has done a thing 10,000 times, that the difference between food that merely functions and food that matters is not in the ingredients. They did not have a grandmother's voice at their ear in the pre-dawn quiet saying that the niet goes in before the heat, and that the creature eating it, any creature, across any gulf of species and biology and evolutionary history, will know the difference. This was not in any protocol. This was not in any report. This was the thing the Vorath wolves had walked 300 kilometers to find, and it was the same thing that had been sitting in the kitchens of the world, in the hands of the people who kept the fires, since before anyone had thought to write it down. In the morning she would get up at 3. She would start the dough. The scout would be at the door, and then the pack, and then whoever else the pack had told, because the word was spreading across the tundra in the way that words spread among creatures who do not write them, carried in the body, proven by the doing. She would cook for them. She would do it the way she always had, without wasted motion, with the full weight of her attention and her care. And the things she put into the food that had no word in any language she'd been given would go in too, because it was not separable from the rest of it. It was not an extra ingredient. It was the condition under which cooking was possible at all. The scout made the recognition resonance. Marin looked up at the stars. "Yeah," she said, "I'll be here." The pack settled into the quiet around her, warm and enormous in the cold hint dark, and the fire behind the kitchen wall was the fire that it had always been, and she was the keeper of it, and she had been for longer than any posting or any contract, longer than her time on this planet or any planet. She had been it since the first time she stood at a counter too tall for her with flour on her hands and her grandmother's voice saying, "Put your heart in first. Everything else follows." That was the whole protocol. That was the whole hint contact model. Put your heart in first. Everything else follows. She sat in the cold and the stars wheeled overhead, and the wolves breathed around her. And she was, in this moment, exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was supposed to be doing, nothing extraordinary, nothing 100 generations of her family hadn't also done in kitchens and over fires from here to the hills of Erzurum to the earliest fire someone first made on behalf of someone else, which was the same gesture, repeated through all of human time, which was, "Here is something I made with care, I offer it, you are not nothing to me." The Vorath wolves understood this. This was the miracle. Not that they were like humans, or that humans were like them. The miracle was that across every gulf of biology and evolution and experience, the act of care was legible. The act of putting something of yourself into the thing you made for another, the niyat, the intent, the goodwill you could not scan but could absolutely taste, the act was legible. Something recognized it. Something always had. Marin put the stone back in her pocket and looked at the horizon where the dawn was beginning its slow advance, and she was glad, quietly, without needing to say it, that she had never stopped being the kind of person who thought it was important not to waste good meat. The wolves were warm against her sides. The stars were going out one by one as the light returned. She thought, "I will need more dried herbs. I will put in a supply request this morning." And then she went to start the bread. The supply request went in that morning as she'd promised herself, and 3 days later a crate arrived from the authority base on the other side of the planet, dried herbs, yes, and also a note from a logistics officer she'd never met, which said, "We've been hearing things about Hint Station. Keep up the good work," as if there were another kind. She filed the note with the other things she didn't quite know what to do with. The stone in her pocket, which had been there so long she'd stopped noticing the weight of it the way you stop noticing a ring on your finger, and a rough drawing that one of the station's younger researchers, a kid named Tamaz who was doing his first posting, had made and slipped under her kitchen door one morning. The drawing showed the cast iron pan with the prep lamp above it and the service door open on the dark, and through the door a suggestion of wolves. Their bioluminescent spine lines a scatter of small light marks, all oriented inward, and in the middle of it all a small figure that was recognizably Marin, standing at the stove with one hand, raised the way she raised it when she was checking the heat above a burner. The drawing was not technically accomplished, but it had something in it that Marin felt was accurate in a way that a very good painting might not have been. Tamaz had written under it, in small handwriting, "This is what it looks like from outside." She had looked at it for a long time. She didn't think of what she did as particularly heroic, and she resisted actively when people tried to frame it that way. The authority had sent a journalist once, 3 months in, and the journalist had wanted to talk about the courage it took to open the door to apex predators night after night, and Marin had told her politely that courage wasn't the word she'd use. She'd said, "They were hungry. I could do something about the hunger. That's not courage, that's just circumstances aligning." The journalist had written the phrase down, and then asked if she had been afraid. Marin had thought about this genuinely, because it deserved a genuine answer. The Voreth wolves were large and alien, and capable of violence on a scale she was aware of every time she stood at the service door. She had never been unaware of what they were. She had watched Voss's footage of Voreth hunts, the speed of them, the coordinated precision, the absolute decisiveness. And she had understood in the way that the body understands things before the mind articulates them that a Voreth pack that decided to treat you as prey would not leave much to analyze afterward. She had known this from the first night, when the first wolf had appeared at the service door with the small dead animal. She had assessed it, the way a person who has spent time in genuinely dangerous places learns to assess things, and she had made a determination. Not that they were safe, that they were not at that moment threatening her, and that there was something being offered that she could receive, if she chose to receive it. "Were you afraid?" the journalist had asked. "Yes," Marin had said, "but the prey needed not to be wasted." This had made it into the article with the phrase "coolness under pressure" attached to it, which Marin had read with a faint sense of having been misunderstood. It wasn't coolness. It was priority. The waste of a thing that had lived was a failure of respect for that life, regardless of the species that had brought it. This was something she had believed since childhood, and it was not something she was able to set aside because an apex predator was watching. The wolves knew this. This was the thing nobody could scan. Voss had tried to explain it once, to one of the authority specialists who kept asking why the Voreth response to Marin, specifically, was so different from their response to all other human contact. Voss had said something about consistent behavioral signaling and cross-species trust building, and the statistical significance of the repeated gift-hand response pattern, all of which was true, and the specialist had nodded and written notes. Then Voss had stopped and said, "And she doesn't fake it." The specialist had looked up. "The care," Voss said, "when she's cooking, she doesn't perform it, it's just there." The specialist had made a note that said something about authenticity as a behavioral signal in cross-species contact scenarios. Voss had looked at Marin afterward with an expression that said she knew the note had missed the point, and there was nothing either of them could do about that. What Voss had been trying to say, and what Marin could have said more simply if anyone had asked her, was that there was no technique involved. Technique was the thing you did when you were thinking about doing it. What Marin brought to the kitchen at 3 in the morning was not technique. It was something older than technique, something that predated the idea of there being a correct way to do a thing, a layer below skill, below method, below the conscious application of knowledge. It was the place in a person where the thing mattered not because of what it produced, but because of what it was. She had read somewhere, she thought in a book her mother had given her, a book about the history of bread in Anatolia, that the oldest human cooking sites showed evidence of preparation beyond survival need. Not just enough heat to make a thing digestible. More. Longer. More careful. As if even the earliest humans had understood that food was not only fuel, that the act of making it well was its own argument for the value of the life that would receive it. The Voreth wolves had a very old relationship with heat they could not themselves produce. This was Voss's theory, carefully qualified, but Maren thought it was more than a theory. She thought it was the explanation for everything. The wolves needed something they could not make, needed it biochemically, in the proteins of the prey that fed them. And they had found it, not by stumbling onto a fire or a machine that produced the right temperatures, but by finding a person who used fire in a specific way, who used it with the right need. She thought the wolves had been looking for this for a long time. She thought it might be written into their cultural memory, the way certain things were written into human cultural memory. Not in language, but in behavior, in the search itself, in the pattern of gift-hand waiting that they had enacted the first time a pack had encountered something that might be what they needed. She thought, and this was the thing she could not put in a report and would not have known how to explain to the journalist, that the wolves were not just looking for heat. They were looking for the right relationship with heat. For a creature that understood, in however different a framework, that a raw thing becoming a sustaining thing was not a mechanical process but a sacred one. She was probably giving herself too much credit, or not enough credit in the wrong direction. She was a cook. She had grown up in a family that understood food as a form of love, and she had spent her adult life doing the things she understood best in places where it was needed. And she had arrived at Hint Station on a standard catering contract and opened a service door one morning and found a wolf waiting. The rest was what happened when you paid attention and didn't waste good meat. The signed accord changed things at Hint Station in practical terms. More staff arrived. A permanent diplomatic liaison office opened. Voss's xenolinguistics team expanded significantly and gained proper equipment. The outpost, which had been a research station of moderate significance, became the primary location for Voreth human collaborative contact, a role that brought resources and visibility, and a great deal of administrative complexity. Maren's kitchen got a second oven and a walk-in cold room, which she had asked for 14 months earlier and received without comment 6 weeks after the accord was signed. She appreciated this. Her crew grew from 3 to 7, and she spent the first month running the new staff through the rhythms of the kitchen in the way she ran every kitchen, not by telling people what to do, but by letting them watch, and then letting them do, and then talking afterward about what had worked and what hadn't. She was not a patient teacher in the sense of having infinite tolerance for repetition, but she was a thorough one, and the thing she was most thorough about was the one that couldn't be taught by instruction. She showed her crew the service door. She showed them the protocol, or what she called the protocol, which was, receive what is brought with respect, prepare it with care, present it without hurry. Don't look directly at the wolves in the dark. Let the scout make the first move at any new encounter. If you are uncertain, be still. She showed them how to break down a Heskin carcass efficiently and with respect, taking every useful part, leaving nothing that had lived to be discarded. She showed them which herbs paired with the fat structure of the meat. She showed them how to judge heat above a burner with the flat of the hand. What she couldn't show them was the thing that made the wolves come back, and she was honest about this. She sat with her crew one afternoon over coffee and told them, the wolves will know if you're afraid. Not because they're reading your body language, though they are, because it changes the food. She was not certain this was literally true in a chemical sense, though Voss had some data suggesting stress hormones in handlers affected meat handling in ways that were detectable. But she believed it was true in the deeper sense. Fear was a kind of inattention. When you were afraid of something, you were spending your attention on your fear instead of on the thing you were doing, and you could taste the difference in the result. And anything that could taste it. Tamaz had asked, "So how do you not be afraid?" She had thought about this. "You decide what matters," she said. "The wolves matter, the food matters. Being afraid doesn't help either of those things, so it gets less room." "That's it." "That's a lot," she said. "Give it time." Tamaz had nodded seriously, and she had seen him at the service door 2 weeks later with the steady, deliberate calm of someone actively practicing the decision she described. The scout had approached him and made the question resonance, and he had stood still and let it happen and then gone back inside without rushing. She had not said anything to him about it. It had not needed saying. Voss told her sometime in the second year that the hint contact model was being taught in the authorities' xenocontact training programs. Not the cooking specifically, though there was a module on reciprocal gift economies and a chapter on what they were now calling the nutritive exchange framework. What was being taught was the behavioral pattern, the consistency, the reliable, repeated offering made without strategic calculation. "They're training people to cook?" Marin asked. "They're training people to engage in repeated, non-strategic, care-based behavioral exchanges," Voss said, in a tone that suggested she was aware of how far this was from the actual thing. "Do they have cast iron pans?" Voss smiled. "I'll put it in the recommendations." The irony, which Marin had turned over many times in the pre-dawn quiet of her second and third years at Hint Station, was that the thing the authority was trying to systematize and replicate was, by nature, resistant to systematization. You could describe it. You could document its outputs. You could build a framework around it and teach the framework and perhaps produce some approximation of the behaviors it generated. But the thing itself, the niyat, the full attention, the care that was not performed but simply present, could not be installed by training. It was already there in people who had it, or it wasn't. The people who had it were not, usually, the people who ended up in xenocontact specialist roles. They were the people in the kitchens, the people in the aid stations, the people who showed up at the edges of difficult situations, with the specific, untheorized, completely practical skill of attending to what was in front of them with the full weight of their care. They were everywhere, these people. They always had been. Marin's grandmother was one of them. Her mother was one of them. The man who had run the galley on the methane station above the gas giant, a taciturn Estonian named Koijula who spoke rarely and cooked with an attention so complete it had felt almost devotional, he had been one of them. She suspected Tamaz was becoming one. She suspected Voss, in her own domain, already was. They were the people who made the fire and kept it right. Not the people who strategized about the fire or documented the fire or built protocols around the fire. The people who were simply there at the fire, every morning before the station woke up, putting their hands to the thing that needed doing and putting themselves, the realist, most unstrategic part of themselves, into it. The wolves had walked 300 kilometers for this. The diplomats had built an accord around it. The xenobiologists had filed 1,000 pages of analysis about it. And Marin had gotten up at 3 in the morning and started the bread, because the bread needed starting and she was there, and it mattered to do it right. This was the whole of it. This was, she thought, sitting on the service step on a winter morning in the 4th year of her posting, with the scout pressing warm and enormous against her left side, and the sky going violet-gray towards sunrise and the pack breathing around her in the cold, everything there was to say about what humans were and what they had always been. Not the generals and the diplomats and the theorists, though those had their place. The other ones, the ones at the fire. The ones who had been at the fire since the first fire, attending to the raw thing and the heat, and the transformation that happened between them, with the specific, irreplaceable ingredient that no scanner could detect and no protocol could replicate. The stone was warm in her apron pocket from her body heat. The scout made the recognition resonance. She was recognized. She looked up at the alien stars, going out one by one as the light came. She went to start the bread.